First off, I apologize for not having done much with this playlist, but now I'm getting back to it a little bit at a time. We're going to cover other fully diminished seventh resolutions. This is an extremely versatile chord when it comes to chromatic modulation. And the options with chromatic modulation are so vast that you have to start really using these teeny tiny moves and start building up your repertoire. In the previous episodes, we did talk about the fully diminished seventh, but we were using each tone as a leading tone and just using 8 possible resolutions by considering each tone as a leading tone. Now we're going to take this and use it as a pivot chord from one key to the other. You could use it as a pivot modulation, but we're going to do it in a way to where we're going to use it as a secondary function chord. And eventually we're going to get to a point to where we're going to be able to create like sequences, like super extended chromatic harmonic sequences. But this is all the result of learning small little moves like I'm going to show you here. So again, the disclaimer is you must know chromatic harmony in key in order for this to be understood. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take G harmonic minor, and the fully diminished seventh chord of 5 is going to be our pivot chord. You must know chromatic harmony in key or else it's going to be completely meaningless what I just said. So normally we do this with the fully diminished seventh of 5 like that, and then go back to G minor. So that's in key chromatic harmony. Your goal is to go back to the tonic. But we're going to recognize that this fully diminished seventh of 5 is also the 7 chord of F harmonic minor, the same set of notes. Enharmonically, they're the same set of notes. This is the enharmonic process. So a common move with that fully diminished seventh chord is to alternate between that and the dominant, and all you have to do is move one note in order to do so. So now, instead of looking at the fully diminished seventh chord as 8 possible resolutions, we're going to use it as a pivot chord. Instead of using it as the fully diminished seventh of 5, we're going to use it as the pivot chord of an enharmonically equivalent fully diminished seventh in F minor, and then move it to the dominant. In the previous episodes, we took that fully diminished seventh chord and looked at each tone as a leading tone. So for like G minor, that E wants to go to that F. Okay. Now we're going to do this. We're going to alter it into a dominant. And both those chords are common to F minor. So one of the typical ways, just in key, for instance, just to make sure we were explaining this right, fully diminished seventh in key, dominant 1, dominant seventh 1. That would be using just diatonic chords in F minor. And you just move one tone from that fully diminished seventh, you get the dominant seventh. Very typical use of the fully diminished seventh in key is to go to the dominant. It's one of the typical moves. So what I would do is create a harmonic sequence that allows me to continuously pivot modulate off of this concept. Okay. By itself, it's not very musical. So if we go through it, I'll just play through it. You have the chords all listed out for you, so I don't want to call it out because it's So at this point, you just want to keep repeating the process, okay? As an exercise. Basically, just to see it as a pivot chord, instead of resolving it as 8 possible resolutions as a leading tone. We're now using it as a pivot chord. Chromatic alteration, but pivoting. So you will eventually go in a circle, giving you this whole step modulation from one minor key to the other in whole steps, eventually arriving at the original key. But what I would do is I'd try to make this musical somehow, some kind of harmonic sequence that repeats, and break away from it. Break away. Look for ways to break out of chains, but notice this melodic harmonic sequence we get, because the inversions I chose, is very chromatic in the low end line. Played really slow. And also the upper part stays very common for quite a while. Then I used a 5 of 5 in E flat minor to get back to, just to break the sequence. So I'm using the sequence below, I'm just making it musical and breaking free of it at some point. So we're not trying to do the greatest thing, we're just trying to make it musical. I could do a variation on that same exact sequence, do something like this. But these chromatic lines are very defining features of like late Romantic era chromatic harmony. Eventually in later episodes you're going to see that you can simply just alter a diminished chord into a dominant chord 4 times, which makes it common to 4 different minor keys, harmonic minor based keys. So in this whole video we're looking at it as an enharmonic pivot chord instead of diatonic. You can take any diminished chord and alter it into a dominant chord, and it's going to lead you to create all kinds of nice little harmonic sequences, chromatic. I could do it like this musically. Let me try something. Breakout. So what we're doing different than the previous episodes in this series, which I'll link, is we're looking at the fully diminished 7th chord as a common pivot chord, enharmonic common pivot chord to 4 different harmonic minor keys, and changing it to a dominant chord, then resolving it instead of just using it as a leading tone. And this actually gives you a bunch of different alternatives to create harmonic sequences and modulations. And one of the things I would do is go through every diminished chord that can be built and practice actually altering it between a dominant, and you'll know that it's actually going to be common to 4 different harmonic minor keys. And later we're going to see it's going to be common also to 4 different major keys as a borrowed chord, which you can take this same fully diminished 7th shape and alter it into the dominant chord of that major key, as if it was a borrowed chord. So again, the biggest problem with chromatic modulation is there's just so many possibilities and so many moves that you can only just show little teeny tiny things like this and leave it up to the person to memorize this kind of move, and then gradually start stacking these moves on top of each other until you can modulate pretty much anywhere chromatically using all kinds of different moves and a vast amount of different options.